Yes, so please let me introduce you Dr. Northoff, who is a philosopher, known as neuroscientist and psychiatrist, holds degrees in all three disciplines. His interest is in neuroscience, philosophy, psychiatry, etc. He had a lot of books, articles, etc. So he will give us a lecture about neurophilosophy of the mind and a spatial temporal approach of it. So please.
Thank you very much for introducing. Thanks for the nice welcome, also for the Russian Matrushka. Yeah, here in this you see two concepts which are sort of a little bit strange for you, maybe as philosophers. Is first neurophilosophy. What does it mean? And what does spatial temporal approach mean? Let me go to the next slide. And of course, as you see, it's about mind and mind-brain. And I think we have often a rather limited understanding of mind. Okay, let me go that back. So, as you probably, some of you may know this photo, you have the conscious mind, which is just the upper tip of the iceberg, and you have the unconscious, which is the deeper layers. And often with our concepts also in philosophy, we often just capture the upper 5%, yeah, the tip of the iceberg. And because that's what is conscious, and that's what we can talk about, and that's what we can put into concepts. And the question is, how can we approach the deeper 95% of the mind in a conceptual way if we're not conscious of them? So this is the key problem here. Okay, I need to get a little bit familiar with this one. So how can we get these 95% still describing a concept, but we are not conscious about it? So this conflict between concepts which are usually associated with consciousness and the need to understand the 95% unconscious part of the mind is really the main motivation for the need to go beyond traditional philosophical methodology to develop a neurophilosophical method. So the question is here, maybe we can use some of the empirical data, as for instance here on the imaging, together with our concepts. And maybe with this particular interaction between concepts and empirical brain data, we may get a better grip on these 95% of the deeper layer of the mind, which, as I will claim, are key for understanding the necessary condition of possible mental states. To keep that formulation in mind, because it's clear I have a certain line of approach here, a transcendental-like approach. I formulated very carefully because there are Kantian specialists here in the room. So that is here, but this is really the main motivational need, maybe to go beyond traditional philosophical methodology to capture this mind. And now, of course, the question you say, yeah, Dr. Northoff sounds all good and nice, but how on earth do you want to link the concepts with the empirical data? So that's really where I said we need a particular methodological strategy, and I call that methodological strategy neurophilosophy. So, and keep in mind, I think we often neglected in philosophy that the method. What kind of method are you using to get to your conclusion? So because this focus on method comes, of course, in part from me also being a neuroscientist, where I really need to look on what inferences does the method allow, and even more important, does not. Yeah, so my first part, the first part of my talk will be really about different forms of neurophilosophy in the literature. So I will basically briefly scan the literature, particularly in philosophy of mind, what is there around. Then in the second part, I really develop, and that's, I think I can really say this, it's really my own approach. It's a non-reductive, as I like to call it, non-reductive neurophilosophy. And that's a particular methodological strategy. Why do I say that? Because as traditional philosophers, you may hear, at least in the Anglo-American world, it's like that, or they hear neurophilosophy, it's just empirical stuff, it's not of interest to us. Yeah, and I see that a lot, and that's what I'm going against. So this is a philosophical talk, and I consider neurophilosophy basically as a refinement, extension of philosophy, and it can make contributions to that. So it's not that I say, okay, it's just empirical and we don't want it, or we're reductions. And in the third part, I want to apply, I show you a paradigmatic example of such a non-reductive neurophilosophical approach. And don't worry, I will not show much empirical data, but I tell you the points where empirical data are considered in supporting the concepts. Yeah, and these are very fine-grained points. And that leads me to what I call a spatiotemporal approach. And I develop sort of an ontology, a spatiotemporal ontology. Obviously, I cannot sketch all of that, so there will be a lot of comments and criticism. So that's basically said. Let me briefly start with the different forms of neurophilosophy. What is there around? I just briefly say, very brief, please forgive me, it's very simple, but I just want to sketch it. What philosophy is about, what question does it address? You all know this metaphysical question, transitional being, epistemological knowledge, ethical issue, norm, and has a long tradition. So you all know this is nothing new, but I want to just sketch a little bit the background against which I develop the neurophilosophy is set. Then, and this is very important for me, and you already see this in my earlier writing in 2004 in the philosophy of the brain, the logical natural world, that relationship is a key methodological issue for me, because neurophilosophy is for me about that. So, of course, in philosophy, you traditionally presuppose a natural world, and the natural world is a subset of the logical world. So now, I didn't sketch this here, but you can see this in my earlier writing, sort of you have, let's say, if you consider the logical world as a whole, you have two subsets. You have the logical world that is identical with the natural world, and the parts of the logical world which are not identical. I know you usually do not think in those terms, but for me as a neurophilosopher, this is key, because it demarcates the territory I am in, and that means it impacts the validity of my concept and my, yeah. So I only claim the validity, what I'm doing, what you see all is just the natural world. My claims are not going to the logical world, those parts of the logical world that are non-identical with the natural world. And that's beyond my scope and also beyond my abilities. I tried to work several years on that. I gave it up because it's too much for me. So method, important. You use traditional, I know there's a lot of things around these days, but the logical conception method. Logical reasoning, you're using concepts, and of course, you use the rules of reason, the norms, and here, that is a distinction I very much like from McDowell and Sellers, logical space of reason versus logical space of nature. So here, of course, philosophy is a logical space of reason, and we can later in the discussion of the McDowell specialist here, how these two worlds are related. So now, that sort of sets the background, and as I said, however, that background is somewhat, let's say, if you go to the current discussion about the mind-body question, that science, and especially neuroscience, seems to answer the originally philosophical questions for conscious subjects. They have mind, body, knowledge, norm, ethics, and so on. And you know all these neurodisciplines, neuroethics, blah, 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 and so on and so on. So, and that is important here because the method you use in science and also neuroscience is different from the one you use in philosophy. So there is, as I like to say, a methodological mismatch, a methodological discrepancy, just methodologically, between the philosophical approach, also in current philosophy of mind, and the neuroscientific approach. Meaning because of their methodological difference, they're by default almost necessarily so, if you want to say so, discrepancies. And I think they very rarely explicated as such. So I say method, method, method. So this is what I'm really, it's a very important key point. So that, of course, raises the question, you know, all that the debate, all the Anglo-Americans, Daniel Dennett, Searle was sort of a little bit moderate, he comes later, John Bickel, Patricia Churchland, all the big theses and blah, 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 and they made a lot of policy and politics and blah, blah, blah with it. You know all that. Do we need to replace philosophy by neuroscience? Yeah? So And then here I already indicate the discrepancy in the method. Logical world, concepts and rules of reason, logical space of reason are replaced by natural world data, rules of observation, which are formal, and the logical space of nature. And the question, can you really do this? Are we really talking the same thing in both contexts? So, and that's the key, this question mark there is really the key starting point for me. So then how can philosophy and how has philosophy react to the challenge by neuroscience? So one way is to separate philosophy and neuroscience, different topics, different methods. That's basically the approach by Bennett and Hacker, Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience. Unfortunately, they just always have one and the same argument, which I agree, whole part confusion, neurological fallacy. But they basically always assign the same argument, which is a little bit boring and philosophically not very sophisticated from my point of view. Then, which has been very popular in the part of the world where I am, reduced philosophy to neuroscience. Once and just replacement. This is Patricia Churchland, the book, 1986. She used the term neurophilosophy, but this is basically just an empirical reduction. And when you look for philosophical flesh there, there's nothing in there. And to be honest, from a German perspective, sorry to say that, the first neurophilosopher was really Schopenhauer. He distinguished between the brain object and brain as subject. And he was much more sophisticated than these people. I'm sorry to have to say it, don't tell them, but it's very disappointing for me as I come from Germany, so after all I have a certain philosophical heritage. So, and the third approach, I already know this is of course my own thing. Okay, so let me briefly sketch the first two, parallelism and the relationship between philosophy and neuroscience. This is obviously Bennett and Hacker, but also somewhat you see it in the writing of Colin McGinn. And I put here Thomas Nagel, but I need to excuse Thomas Nagel because when you read the writings by Thomas Nagel, he really seems to be the most philosophical, sophisticated one. He doesn't provide an answer, but he raises brilliant questions. And you will see this later in my talk. And he has never been conceived as such in the philosophy of mind because of the very narrow scope. So he has been conceived, but I think he has been misread. This philosophical sophistication which he has is not really there. So I will come back to that. And of course, I don't need to say if you have methodological parallelism, this precludes any interaction between philosophy and neuroscience. Yeah, and that's basically the way I think we say Bennett Hacker consider that. And then of course, that's the impact. You have a deep divide. You have no interaction. You see there's no arrow. There's no relationship between the upper part and the lower part. You have the logical space of reason, logical conceptual method, logical rules, and you have down there, you have the logical space of nature, empirical nature, and you have also probably a distinction between personal, subpersonal level. Yeah, and that's what Bennett and Hacker make their argument about the confusion of the personal and subpersonal level. That's basically the whole neurological fallacy. So obviously you can imagine I'm not happy with that one. So no way. Then you have method of reductive neurophilosophy. So this basically looks like this. If you look into the literature, you can distinguish between sort of two different forms of reductionism. Narrow reductionism, you infer the philosophical concepts from the neuroscientific facts, and that's really the way Churchland does it. And Bickel is even worse. So this is, yeah. And you see that kind of really has run out of steam. It was very popular 10 years ago, and now it's basically sidelined. They were politically extremely active. They put everywhere, but it's really not productive. Wider reductionism, I would, for instance, sort of you have an adaptation of the philosophical concepts to the neuroscientific context. So it's not an inference, but it's sort of more an adaptation. And that's the way I read Searle, for instance, whom I like. And Karl Craver has sort of this multi-layered model, more from the epistemological side. Yeah, and here it would basically ultimately come down to this one. You reduce, oops, sorry. No, this is the wrong one. Too many buttons. You reduce, now you see the black arrow, you reduce the upper to the lower, you reduce the logical space of reason to the logical space of nature. Yeah, and that, of course, when you just remember the initial, which I didn't put in a slide here, but when you consider the initial relationship between the natural logical world, the natural world nesting as a subset within the logical world, that reductionism doesn't work. It's not conceptually plausible. Yeah, it violates that. So you somehow need to find a method which accounts for the natural world being part of the logical world, but not being identical with it. The very, very tricky thing. That's for me the very difficult origin. And that's where I also said later ontology versus metaphysics. So then, and that ultimately looks like this. And you see all the neuro domains here, neuro phenomenology, neuroethics. I put also neurophilosophy in, but to be honest, I would not like to be included in this one. Yeah, because that's not the way I see it. And you see the directionality of the arrows. It goes from the phenomenal, ethical, phenomenological, ethical, epistemological, metaphysical domain to the empirical domain. Yeah, but you don't have, for instance, a feedback loop. You don't. Yeah, so that basically, I think it's a fair overview of the main approaches these days in the brain-mind field, in the philosophy of mind, to a sort of neurophilosophy or some extension. So and I already pointed out the insufficiencies because neither model, neither the parallelism nor the reductionism accounts for this very peculiar relationship of the logical world and the natural world. Yeah, the natural world is a subset of the logical world. That's why usually ontology, for instance, is considered a subset of metaphysics. However, you have also a distinction between the natural world and those parts of the logical world that are not identical with the natural world. So you have sort of two subsets of the logical world. And that's the key. That, for me, makes it that both a parallelism, because in case of a parallelism, you would have the logical world here and the natural world here without any overlap. In the case of reductionism, the natural world should be identical with the logical world. It isn't. Instead, the natural world is a subset, nested, like the smaller Russian door within the larger one in the logical world. So you need a methodological strategy that accounts for that peculiar relationship. That's the beginning and really of my questioning for neurophilosophy. Yeah, you see this in my earlier book, in Philosophy of the Brain, where I still dare to do all this. I have a whole chapter on 20 pages on just methodological strategy. Since I have abandoned because I got so much contradiction and both sides don't understand it. Yeah, so it's really a key thing, and that's a very philosophical issue for me. Yeah, and I think you can also see it in the history of philosophy. I will cite some examples. So let me say what I'm doing. Okay, I think, yeah, okay. So first, I am against methodological reductionism. So first, what is non-reductive neurophilosophy? The term could also be different, but I just want to really make a clear distinction here. What can neither be reduced to the logical argumentative method of philosophy, nor to the observational experimental method in neuroscience. And that's absolutely key. Yeah. So that makes it necessary. Then you say, yeah, Northoff, how do you want to do this? How can we link the two? Is there maybe, and you will come up, is there a necessary or intrinsic linkage between the two methods? That's what I'm after. Second, and that's basically a corollary of that, against ontological metaphysical reductionism, what is called mind and its various features like consciousness, self and free will, blah, 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 and philosophy can neither be reduced to the brain nor to the body. And that's a key relation. I will come up later. You will understand why I'm saying that we need to include the world-brain relation. I will come up with that later. Good. So how does this work? When you have this, remember you had a similar picture for the other forms, and you really have a bilateral arrow. Okay, let me go this back. This is this arrow which is key, bilateral. Mm-hmm. And you have a bilateral. So now, of course, you say, yeah, Northoff, the arrow is nice, but provide some flesh to the bones. What exactly does it mean? What kind of methodological strategy? So this is for me where neurophilosophy comes in. And I want to focus your attention on the lower part. So you have a spectrum of different methods rational arguments, conceptual analysis, phenomenological analysis, observation, experience. So the key for me for non-reductive neurophilosophy approach, how can we link these different methods without reducing them? And that's what I want to show in the following. How can we link the different methods in a non-reductive and also non-parallel way? That's really, for me, the heart of neurophilosophy, and also beyond for linking science and philosophy, which, I mean, when you look into the history of philosophy, Kant had a lot of empirical stuff in his writing, Hume too, so they somehow did it implicitly and tacitly. And I will provide some quotes by Kant later. The question is, how can we make this can we explicate that in a more systematic way? That's basically the way what I'm doing. So thesis number one, there's an intrinsic or necessary connection or linkage of neuroscience with philosophy. Meaning, the bilateral iterative, I will explain that later, dependence of the data and facts in neuroscience on the concepts in philosophy. You all know this as philosopher, you always like to point out, come on, you acquired these data, and they presuppose a certain model or concept, a certain theoretical framing. And as a neuroscientist, I completely agree with that. I'm always surprised when we discuss really tiny, minuscule empirical data in our group, and suddenly a conceptual question comes up. Yeah, so you conceive the same empirical data in a different way in the context of different concepts and models. Yeah, and for instance, model of mind-brain relation. So this is basically what I try to formulate here, from facts to concepts. Concepts enter unavoidably, you can even say necessarily so. Yeah, the question, of course, why is there such a necessary reliance on concepts in science? That, of course, would be an interesting question to pursue. Since there's no concept-free neuroscience, concepts are relevant for any science, not only for neuroscience. I mean, you see this paradigmatically in physics, in testing for conceptual plausibility of neuroscientific findings. So conceptual plausibility, keep that in mind. And here, you all know this very famous, thoughts without contents are empty, inclusions without concepts are blind. So I reformulate that, I take the liberty. And philosophy without science is empty, science without philosophy is blind. So I'm sure so far you would follow, you'd be happy, finally a neuroscientist realizing philosophy is important, not throwing arrows. Okay, now but prepare yourself for the next slide. So now it's the other way around, that also your concepts are not completely immune when we operate in the natural world. Yeah, when we just operate in that part of the logical world which is non-identical with the natural world, then all that doesn't apply. It's clear. But for that part of the logical world which is identical with the natural world, these two theses apply. So the validity is here just for the natural world, not for the logical world, the totality of the logical world. So that's very important for you to consider, particularly if you're inclined to argue against me and this is all wrong. So because that will be my counter argument for that. Yeah. I'm used to that kind of arguments from Kantians, yeah. So they throw that and say, you make a fallacy here. It's a fallacious inference. I say, no, you need to distinguish these two kinds of logical words. So this is very important. Also, the concepts are dependent, and from concepts to facts, facts enter unavoidably philosophy. Since there's no relevant fact-free philosophy, I say philosophy of the natural world. So please. That restriction always keep in mind. If you put your logical world, of course, then you say not of Goho. Facts are relevant for relevant philosophy and testing for the empirical plausibility of concepts. You see what I introduce here, two methodological concepts, the empirical plausibility and the conceptual plausibility. So now, of course, you can say, yeah, Northoff, please provide me criteria for the plausibility. So how much they agree, and I will show you in the practical application of that later in the second part about the spatiotemporal approach to the mind, brain, where I show you demarcate exactly the points, what is conceptual plausibility, what is empirical plausibility. And you have a beautiful quote here by Alfred North Whitehead, whom I very much appreciate. You will see later why. Obviously, I'm a liberal philosopher, so I don't follow everything what these historical people say, but I think that's my fair right. But this is a beautiful quote. I think it's relatively at the beginning of Process and Reality. You see it very early, page 5. It's a beautiful quote. The true method of discovery is like the flight of an aeroplane. It starts from the ground of particular observation. As in science, that's what I added. It makes a flight in the thin air of imagination and generalization, as in philosophy, I added that. And it again lends for renewed observation, as in science, rendered acute by rational interpretation. So here what you already see, it's an iterative loop. It's not circular. So if you have a pure logical perspective, you would say not of this is circular. So I know this argument very well, again, as the Kantian and the German philosophers use that a lot against me. And I said, no, it's an iterative loop. Because the way you consider the, after you landing again on the on the airport, as renewed observation, you have a different perspective on the same facts. And trust me, I know this very well, just from my neuroscience, this constantly back and forth. So that is sometimes very confusing, because you like to put an a priori definition of your concept. I'd say you here as philosophers. You want at the beginning a clear a priori definition of the concept, and then you basically do your declinations throughout the paper or the text or the book. However, neurophilosophy is not like that, because you don't have an a priori definition of the concept. It's more a posteriori. However, it doesn't mean that that definition is non-necessary or contingent. So that's important. Here I open the Pandora's box of necessary a priori, necessary a posteriori. It will come back later in my ontology, because there's a key distinct feature of non-reductive neurophilosophy that it supports necessary a posteriori inferences, not necessary a priori inferences or contingent a posteriori inferences, as you would say that what happens in science. So very, very important here. And so meaning when he lands again, when he comes down, he sees the same ground in a very different way, because he was up there in outer space. Yeah. Okay. So here you see a key feature of philosophy for me. This is what I call iterative, as distinguished from circular. Yeah, because the traditional inquiry was this circular. Okay, and that's why I wrote these two papers on Whitehead and also on Kant. So here I just want to, I don't want to go into detail of this, but you see, and that's the claim I would make, non-reductive philosophy does not replace classical historical philosophy, but I would say it enriches it. I think you can't read this, but it complements, it enriches it. Yeah, so basically I'm doing the same what Kant did to Hume. I'm trying to do the same with current philosophy and extend it, because I have a new method. So for me, everything goes through method. I mean, if you had asked me 20 years ago, I wouldn't have said that method doesn't matter. It's just the outcome which is uninterested. But now I really say, if you have a new method, and I mean, Kant had a brilliant idea with his transcendental method, it opens him new questions and then also new answers. So same here, where I say my neurophilosophy is sort of an explication of something which was implicitly there. It's a new, I would say, parenthesis, methodological strategy, and that opens up new questions and gives you a broader horizon. Yeah, it doesn't reduce it, doesn't make it irrelevant. It's just that I don't say Kant was stupid. I don't say we should forget him. Yeah, I had talks where people say, yeah, this is rather embarrassing when I mention Kant. Yeah, I say, absolutely fair. I'm standing on the shoulder of these people, but of course, I'm also allowed to have my own view. That's what they did. So for me, what I say, for me, philosophy, neurophilosophy, the way I consider, is part of philosophy as a whole, if you have a wider meaning of philosophy. Very important. Good. So now I come to that. I remember what I said initially with the logical and natural world. It somehow resurfaces in this picture. So here you have the pink stuff, obviously, is philosophy. You have the logical world, logical space of reason. And part of that is your natural world, the logical space of reason. nature. Sorry, that was a Freudian unconscious slip. And exactly that border is neurophilosophy. So exactly there I would locate philosophy, neurophilosophy, in a non-reductive way. Yeah. So meaning neurophilosophy, as I understand it in this context, is a special methodological strategy that focuses on the nestedness of the natural world within the logical world. And you see why I like your matryoshka so much, just like the Russian dolls. That's why I was very happy to get the present. Unfortunately, I didn't put the picture here. In my neuroscience talks, you will see I have a lot of pictures of them. Yeah, so nestedness is the key. So now it's basically neurophilosophy, as I understand it, is a methodological strategy to capture this kind of nestedness. Yeah, without succumbing to parallelism or reductionism. Yeah? So I think that is very, very important. And if you don't understand this, if you say this is crap, if you say it's not relevant, the red stuff and the pink stuff, then of course you will not say that neurophilosophy is relevant, and you will say Northoff, this is all crap, this is just empirical stuff, go home, this is not philosophy. If you say, come on, all the pink stuff is just empirical stuff, it's not relevant, it basically can be integrated into the red stuff, then you say, of course, Northoff, what are you doing? It's not relevant. So you see here, it's a beautiful example how your methodological presupposition shape your questions. Yeah. If I do not consider the red stuff as distinct from the pink stuff, the question, how do I link these two realms, is nonsensical, stupid. Yeah. And of course, vice versa. If you just have the fact that the pink stuff is reduced to the empirical stuff, then why do we need such an iterative method, which puts in facts and concepts you would say is nonsense. Yeah. And that I can see that a lot in the kind of discussions I had over the last year. So this is really, really key to understand this kind of nestedness. Yeah, here, this is, you see, this is basically, I don't want to go into detail. I know it's a very complex thing. And admittedly, I haven't worked out each step as I should have, but I'll just give you an idea. So you start with a certain concept. Let's say you start a certain concept of mind. Then you look, let's say you start, let's say, with a sense of self or free will. Then you look what kind of different concepts there are around. So that's already very different. You do not start with just one particular concept of free will, but you look for all the different kind of concepts of free will. And by that, you leave it for the time being. So you start with that and look which different concepts are there around, just in the philosophical discussion. Then you look, let's say, into the neuroscience. There's been a lot of research done on free will and voluntary, and then you see how much do they really match. So how much do the often more implicit concept of free will in the neuroscience fit with the explicit definition of free will in philosophical discussion. So that's basically what you call a concept-concept conversion, because these are flexible, these terms, of course, said. And then, of course, then you look what kind of empirical data in the brain are associated with that kind of neuroscientific concept of free will. Then you go to neuroscientific hypothesis, experimental variable data. And of course, the kind of hypothesis, variables, and data you consider and acquire strongly depend upon the kind of concept of free will you presuppose in neuroscience. And then you go back, and of course, there's also a distinction between data and facts, which I don't want to go into. So basically, you go back, and then you compare that, what you get in terms of the data, and the implicitly presupposed concept of free will. You compare that again with the philosophical concept. So remember the Whitehead quote. You start from the ground, you go up, and then you go down. Here, in a way, the way I sketched it, you start maybe from philosophy. Of course, you can start at each point in this iterative model. And let's say here I sketch it, you start from the air, then you come down, and then you go back up into the air. Yeah, so philosophy is, of course, here the air in the sky. And you have a continuously adaptive matching, looking for conceptual plausibility, empirical plausibility, And you will see this, I will demonstrate that in my second part of my talk. So meaning it's not a circular movement. That's very important. I do not just explicate in the empirical steps what is already in the conceptual step, but I enrich it, because here within the natural world, there's no one-to-one correspondence between data and facts. Very important. In the logical world, those parts of the logical world which are non-identical with the natural world, yes, you can make that point, but not in the natural world in which we live. So that's very important. And that's basically trying to see how much overlap is there between these domains. I know this is very abstract. It's basically a philosophy of neurophilosophy, if you want to say so, and should definitely be more developed. But yeah, yeah. Okay, let's look. Yeah, and with that, it's basically finishes the second part of the non-reductive neurophilosophy, the method. And now I want to provide you some flesh to the bones. Basically, now I want to show you an example how that applies to a specific question. So when you see my writings, I applied this method to various kind of features. But here I want to particularly to the mind and the mind-body problem. And you see my solution to this. Okay. So here is a novel approach. Whoops, sorry, I should have done. So this is a very nice comment on the mind-body problem here from the New Yorker. So get up. No. So you see the discrepancy, and basically what can you make? So how does non-reductive neurophilosophy can provide here a novel approach? Because there's no doubt when you look into the philosophy, you know, 20, 30 years it was a hot topic, and now it's sort of, yeah, it's sort of sidelined because people say maybe it doesn't work, it's a wrong problem, nobody really knows, and all kinds of being theories, dualism, monism, parallelism, panpsychism is hit now, it changes every 5 years. So what? So you will see my stance on the, you already see the way I talk about this, you already see how and then panpsychism is high now, in 5 years is next one. Okay, so key assumption here. The brain is part of the world. And the brain is not the whole. So the brain, literally, and that's what I meant to indicate. Again, my preference for your Russian matryoshkas, it's nested within the world. It's a smaller part within the world as a whole. Yeah, and however, being part of the world, the brain must be characterized by certain features which is shared with the world, because otherwise it couldn't be part of the world. So I'm interested in those features which the brain shares with the world, which makes the brain as part of the world. So in that, I don't dwell on that in this talk, but that makes it different from many current and past philosophy of mind approaches, because they looked for what is special in brain and mind compared to the world, because the mind and brain seem to look so special. So I call this the argument of specialness versus non-specialness, and I don't develop that in this talk, but it's a key moment, because once you say the brain is, or mind and brain are special compared to the rest of the world, and that obviously goes back to Descartes, I don't need to tell you that, and has been carried out since, even into current neuroscience. They look for special features as compared to the non-special features of the brain, because they assume these special features to be associated with the mind. You see this in basically all neuroscientific theory of consciousness. So this is very important. I look for the other way. What do brain and world share? And I said that sharing may be key for the brain to be a necessary condition of possible mental state. Yeah, so very important. And keep an eye, of course, I always emphasize the possible you see here in Kantian. So that's also key for me, important, meaning if you want to look for that, and of course I don't need to tell you, ontology is about the world, so exists the way I conceive ontology, of course feel free to contradict me, existence and reality in the natural world. In order to develop an ontology of the brain, we need to go beyond the brain to the world. And we need to look exactly for those features the brain shares with the world. Yeah? So, and that is already clear. That makes impossible, I don't show that argument here, all the kinds of panpsychism and all this kind of model. So this is, I developed that in this book, which has very empirical parts, ontological parts, and I discuss some of the ontological parts, which are mainly the ontological chapters. It's chapter 10, 11, and 12. Before, there are a lot of chapters on the model of consciousness, model of brain, and so on and so on. Okay. So how can we describe the existence and reality / ontology of world and brain? Of course, please forgive me. I bring it down to two alternative forms. I take a very coarse view here, two alternative forms of ontology. I call that element-based ontology, properties of substances as the most basic features of existence and reality. Typical approach, of course, Descartes, substances. But however, if you replace the substances by, let's say, by mental properties or physical properties, it's still an element-based approach. Yeah? So, and very important here, elements are primary, relations secondary. And I will sketch that in the next slide a little bit more in detail. And for me, basically, the whole Anglo-American philosophy of mind, with almost no exception, let's say maybe the Whiteheadian people are different, basically has that kind of ontology. So I'm on a very basic presupposition here. Yeah? Then you have relation-based ontology. So now here, relation are the basic features of existence and reality. Relation is primary, elements are secondary, or they both are co-occurring. So I know there's a logical contradiction could be here. So, and people who are, and this is of course a very diverse field. You see here the Whitehead can be considered one example of that. The process-based ontology, structural realism, interestingly so, which I do, strongly rely on in my 2018 book. You can see the difference-based ontology of Deleuze also in that sense, and hidden behind the black one is Bergson, depends upon the interpretation. Okay, how do I conceive these two forms of ontology? Here, element-based ontology, you have primacy of elements over relation. So you have these elements, substances, then you connect them. And then, of course, you ask, are mind and body different properties of substances? So what I want to point out here is the kind of ontology strongly impacts the kind of questions you ask with respect to mind and body. And I'm more interested in setting up the question than providing yet another answer to this question. So that's very important if you want to understand my approach. I'm really more interested in setting up whether the question is conceptually, empirically plausible. Yeah, it's not the answer, because I think your answer depends on the question, and that in turn depends upon the kind of ontology you presuppose. Then relation-based, so here you have the relations first, and then you have the primacy of structure over relation. Of course, it's very simple and naive what I do here. And mind and body. And then, of course, you say, unfortunately, it's the black stuff hidden there. There is a basic relation, and let's say, for instance, how is a world related to the brain such that mental features occur? So here you have a very different question already with respect to mind and body. So this is, I'm still drawing, I think it's a, yeah, okay, I'm still drawing. So I'm still drawing here on basically, it's a very bird's eye view of different forms of ontology. And of course, I'm aware that there are many others. But I think it's a very basic two main categories. And the question is, which one now is more, and this is now where neurophilosophy kicks in, for instance, which one is more empirically plausible? You can make a case that both are conceptually plausible. Yeah, and I think that has been made. And this is very important, but which one is more empirically plausible? So this is where, for me, neurophilosophy comes in. Yeah, the method of neurophilosophy, where you now try to probe your concepts, let's say you have two different concepts of ontology, you try to probe them into the empirical context and see which one is more plausible. Yeah, so you go into the empirical data. So, and that is important because they imply different questions with respect to mind and body. Yeah, and henceforth different problems. As I said, I cannot develop that in full detail. You can read that in the book. Here on the left, element-based ontology is the mind-body problem. The right, relation-based ontology is, as I would argue, what you call the world-brain problem. Okay. So what do I mean by relation-based ontology? And that's why I want to provide a little bit flesh to the bones. What do brain and world share? And I would say they share the most basic coordinates of time and space. So when I speak of time and space, I do not mean time and space as we perceive or cognize them. It is often considered like that in neuroscience, but it's really how time and space are constructed. And I know there's a whole discussion, particularly about metaphysics of time, presentism, and block view and others. So I don't want to go into that, but you can already imagine what kind of view I endorse. And again, I endorse it for empirical reasons, meaning, yeah, and presentism or dynamic view. So, and then the question is, how is this world, how is the brain related to the world? Meaning, what kind of features do they share? In a relation-based ontology, what constitutes their relation? And I would argue it's a spatial-temporal relation. Yeah. So the brain and the world are related in a temporal way and in a spatial way. So you have time and space are shared, and interestingly, the brain itself constructs its own inner time and space. And there you see, I don't need to tell you that, and that distinguished from how we perceive the time and space in the world / the outer time and space, and that obviously goes back to Kant, that inner outer time space distinction. So meaning, I will present that the degree to which the inner time and space of the brain, how the brain constructs its own inner time and space, matches or corresponds only in part, obviously, to the time and space of the world, because the time and space of the world has much larger scales than the time and space of the brain. For instance, seismic earth waves start way before the actual earthquake, and these are very, very slow time scales, which are not present in our brain. So we in neuroscience, and you will hear a lot about that in my empirical talks tonight and on Saturday, we investigate really how the brain constructs its own inner time and space, and how that impacts your consciousness and your perception, consciousness of time. I don't want to go into that, but what is important, and for instance, you can see how the brain constructs its own inner time and space. Empirically, that is manifest in what we call spatial topography, basically the organization of different regions, networks to each other, and temporal dynamic, how they slow, fast waves, for instance. As I said, that will be more. But what is important here in the current ontological context, how does that inner time and space of the brain stand relative to the time and space of the world? So that's a key moment. And what is important, and this is of course now, you see finally the Russian dolls. So you see that why I like this, because I do really think there's a lot of evidence. We have different scales, different sizes, but the same shape. Yeah, that's typical, and that's nestedness. Yeah, so the brain's inner time and space is nested within the world, time and space. So and this is one point where the empirical side of things come in. You call this different size, same shape, you call this scale-free activity or long-range temporal correlation. And there's a lot of evidence for that occurring in the brain. And there's a lot of evidence for that kind of scale-free activity or nestedness directly being related to consciousness. So I don't show the empirical side, I do that in my other talk. But what is imagined? So for me, that is basically the kind of ontology suppose, so let's say you have the time scales of the brain, you have an inner extension, you have an inner duration. That's basically specification of the concept of inner time and space. And then you have the world. And basically, if you take a true ontological world, a true ontological view, the world must also be characterized by its own intrinsic time and space, inner duration, inner extension. And the degree to which they match and overlap, that's key. And that again, you see, you have the Russian dolls, and you also have to see when you go even further towards east. So one of my Chinese students, no, we have much better stuff than the Russian dolls. We have the Chinese crystal balls, so they presented this one. So these are little balls, very refined. So that ball you have, when you look into detail, you have a lot of little crystal balls there. So same thing. So I leave it up to you to decide here. So I'm just neutral. Yeah. So, but you see a nestedness of different time and space scales. That's the point I want to make. So why is that? Why emphasizing such spatial and temporal nestedness? Because, so that I would say can be an ontological nestedness. Whereas also on the empirical side, I can measure that, and I can show that the degree of spatial and temporal nestedness is highly related to your level to your consciousness. Yeah, I don't show that here because that's the empirical side of things. So now the question is, which ontology is the relation-based ontology of world and brain empirically plausible with respect to mind and brain? So that's the key point I need to address here to really say, okay, does it make sense? So element-based ontology, which, and I know this is very strange for you as philosophers, then I say, okay, which of the two ontologies is more empirically plausible? Remember, you start your neurophilosophical investigation with a different kind of concepts. And then you probe which one is empirically plausible. That's what I'm doing here, of course, on a very basic level. So for you, if you have a pure logical conceptual method, you say, Northoff, this is bullshit. Yeah, you cannot do that. However, as a neurophilosopher, I can, because I have a different methodological strategy. Very important. So what is invalid in the philosophical methodological context may be valid within the different methodological context of neurophilosophy. Very important before you want to kill it. And that's why I say now, methodologically, this requires an iteratively to the empirical domain. I presented that earlier. So now we do this. So, and I said, don't worry, I don't go into empirical detail, but what we can really see here, we develop this on the empirical side, the temporal spatial theory of consciousness, and that the brain's inner time, basically the main message here is the brain's inner time and space, and you can measure that with spatial topography, power spectrum, and blah, 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 is key for consciousness. So, and we try with that, bridging the gaps to neuronal phenomena. This is all not relevant from an ontological context here, but it supports empirical plausibility. And this TTC, as we call it, temporal spatial theory of consciousness, has 4 different mechanisms. This is all empirical now. Temporal spatial nestedness, again, the nestedness, the Russian doors, so that will come tonight too. Alignment, expansion, globalization. You don't need to know this detail. But what is important, I want to focus on this one because that's ontologically relevant. So one mechanism is temporal spatial alignment. So when you listen to music, you unconsciously you tap with your finger, with your index finger or whatever, with all your fingers or with your foot, the rhythm of the music. So you synchronize your own behavioral activity with the outer rhythm of the music. So you align, and in the brain you can literally show this, that you synchronize, you match your own inner time of the brain with the outer time of the music. So you align yourself. And the brain has time scales for that, because music is not just one time scale. You have multiple time scales. And you tell you, Shostakovich, Prokofiev were masters in combining different time scales and fooling your perception. And so the brain has also different time scales. You call that intrinsic neural time scales. It's a paper we just published in Nature there. And so the brain has a variety of different time scales. And those timescales allow the brain to align to the timescales of the world, of the external environment. Yeah, so this is sort of a matching process. I think this is what it indicated here. So it's a matching, a stochastic matching between the brain's timescales and the environmental timescales. So, and I would argue this provides indeed support that the connection between world and brain is temporal, it's a matching. So now you say, does that kind of matching of timescales impact your consciousness? So first, you have a matching of timescales, you have a temporal spatial alignment. For space, I didn't demonstrate, I can do that. But temporal spatial alignment between brain and world, and that supports, provides empirical support, as I see it, for a spatial temporal and relation-based ontology. Yeah, it's an empirical support. I don't infer it, it's just in accordance with that. So that's important. Now you say, yeah, Northoff, this is all nice and well, but how does that impact consciousness? So these are actually real data. You see, when you have your time scale, no, I don't have the laser point here. You have to look just at the upper, you can measure these time scales in the brain, which is what you call autocorrelation function. Details don't matter here. But what is important, if you have fine-grained, faster and slower time scales, you perceive the runner, the different time points of the runner in a distinct way. So you perceive a starting to run, and fully run, upper run. Now, if you have longer time scales in your brain, you integrate all the different time points from the environment, and then you just perceive the runner in a very blurry way. That's what you see lower right. Yeah. So if your time scales in the brain are too long, you don't have that sort of fine-grained temporal resolution for your environmental context anymore, and suddenly you perceive the whole thing in a very blurry way. And that's data-based. So meaning your time scales in the brain, on the one hand, they connect you to the world through the stochastic matching process, the degree to which they overlap. And of course, the better they overlap, the more you can perceive the world in a fine-grained way. The prototypical examples where they don't overlap is Thomas Nagel. That we don't have the ultrasonic waves of the bat available, and that we cannot, so that why we perceive the world in a different way than the bat. So there you don't have that matching, and that's what Thomas Nagel called point of view, which I do think is not the same as first-person perspective. Very importantly, point of view is a much more basic feature of subjectivity. And that, I think, is often confused in current philosophy of mind. So you have, so meaning, here's a time scale. What I want to show with this little empirical excursion, you have empirical, you have a twofold support. First, you say you have a matching of the time scales of the brain with the time scales of the world. So meaning, maybe the relation between brain and world-brain relation, is primarily temporal, and then also spatial, and that may provide support, empirical support, for a relation-based ontology. Now you say, and the second line is that kind of world-brain relation, of the matching of the timescales between world and brain, relevant for mental features? Yes, because it changes your consciousness, if you change that. So here you have an empirical support for a particular form of ontology being relevant for mental features, like consciousness, relation-based ontology is more empirically plausible for consciousness than a pure property-based ontology or element-based ontology. Admittedly, I left out many parts of that proof here, but I just want to indicate how it works. So brains in terms of timescales is clear. I said all that, nothing new. So, and then what I do in the okay, because that's basically the same thing as the previous slide. So meaning brain's time and space are nested concurrent within the world time and space. And then in the book, I make different spatial temporal nestedness as an ontological feature and spatial temporal directedness. Why the directedness? Because you always direct from the larger Russian doll to the smaller one. Yeah, the larger one contains the smaller one, but the smaller one cannot contain the larger one. So there's the directiveness. Now I come close to the end. I just want to have two brief counter arguments, of course, among the many which you probably will raise. So first counter argument, why do you make such a distinction? Why do you speak of world-brain versus brain-world relation? And it's very, very interesting. In basically in all the Anglo-American world, they said, so I introduce this world-brain relation, and they answer, and then they raise the question about the brain-world relation. So for them, it's immediately the same, and of course I would say that's a Copernican fallacy, because it's a very anthropocentric thing. So why do I speak of brain-world versus the world-brain relation? Remember my example with the music. Your brain actively aligns itself to the music of the rhythm. Of the rhythm of the music. Yeah. So that's basically meaning the world shapes the time scales of your brain. Yeah, very important, particularly ontologically, you need to say that. So it's an active, it's the brain can synchronize, but the brain's neuronal activity are shaped by the time scales of the world. So spatial temporal nestedness, spatial temporal directiveness. Yeah, the larger time scales shape the smaller time scales. The larger Russian doles contain the smaller doles. Spatial temporal directiveness. Very important. And that I would say, that's why I consider the world-brain relation, the way I sketch it, as an ontological relation. That's very important, and I characterize it in a spatial temporal way, as I already said, spatial temporal directiveness. Then we have obviously also a brain-world relation. So your brain also, your mind also shapes the world. And that, of course, the brain-world relation. But I would argue that is more epistemologically and, of course, also empirically relevant. So for me, world-brain relation, brain-world relation are not the same. And if you want to link mental features, you need to link it to the word-brain relation. Consciousness and epistemologically is cognition. So now you may be surprised again and say, what does Northoff do? Consciousness is not a form of cognition? Yes, it's not. When you look at the empirical data, again, another empirical detour, short, you see all the various forms of cognition, working memory, attention, have been related, both empirically and conceptually, to consciousness, no empirical support. Now it's more and more clear that consciousness is not just attention or working memory, something different. Yeah. So meaning there is empirical support for that distinction. So second counter argument, and that goes into the more interesting, philosophically more interesting side of things for me, is the world-brain relation really necessarily or just contingently related to consciousness and mental features? Because you need that necessary relation in order to make a real philosophical point. If it's not necessary, it's just continue to say, okay, not of you, just do empirical stuff, go home. We're not interested. So my claim is, yes, the world-brain relation is necessarily related to self and consciousness and other mental features, but it's not necessary a priori, but it's necessary a posteriori. So here I obviously draw strongly on Kripke, the water chemical formula and water, and also Thomas Nagel. And I will give you a beautiful quote by Thomas Nagel, who really, it's a very good paper. It appears at first blush that we have a clear and distinct enough graph of both phenomenological consciousness and physical brain process to see that there can be no necessary connection between them. Yeah, so that I would say is a clearly conceptual argument. And he's right, there's no necessary a priori connection because the concept of brain doesn't imply the concept of consciousness. And the same goes for the world-brain relation. There's nothing in the concept of world-brain relation. I can define it in whatever way. It does not necessarily a priori entail consciousness. Unless, of course, and now that's for me the stupidity, unless I go for panpsychism. Yeah. But that's, of course, for me just a compensatory strategy. So now, how do I show this necessary a posteriori? That's important. So here is a paper which is about to come out. Here you see again, whoops, sorry, I need to show this. The upper thing, of course, you know the deeper layers of mind, which are interesting. In current philosophy and also neuroscience, there is a gap of contingency between the brain and the mind. And I think this is a key problem. I don't want to go into detail about this, but it's a really a key way. So how can we resolve this gap of contingency and make a necessary a posteriori linkage between them? So here you see again another quote by Thomas Nagel. So here I don't read the whole quote in detail, but he makes it from the same paper, 2002, where he infers, of course, that water can be frozen or fluid. He can entail that. It's entailed by H2O. Of course, you all know this is the original by Kripke, and he speaks of an upward entailment. So how does the chemical formula of water entail the consistency of the liquid or the frozen water? So, and he said that we do not have such a corresponding upward entailment for the relationship of brain and mind. So for me now, what I would say, it is this exactly, it's a spatial temporal entailment. It's your spatial temporal nestedness, your spatial temporal directedness, which provides for necessary a posteriori connection of brain and consciousness. I cannot do the details. It's a very complicated proof. You find it in chapter 10, which cost me 3 years to work on because it was such a nightmare. So that's really, for me, the key. So you can show that spatial temporal ontology makes possible a spatial temporal entailment of the world, of the mental by the world-brain relationship. And the proof, the argument basically goes twofold. First, you need to show the necessity of the spatial temporal relation between world and brain. So that's a necessary relation if you presuppose a spatial temporal ontology, and the brain is part of the world, being nested within the world. And then the second part of the proof that you need to show from such a spatial temporal world-brain relation, the necessary a posteriori connection with the mental features. So now you say, how can you link? I'm almost done. How can you link then the mental features with the spatial temporal features? So this is again where it comes to sort of more empirical material. Are mental features spatial temporal features? Is your experience of a mental features primarily a spatial temporal features? You have inner time consciousness, Husserl phenomenology. And so that's what we developed here. And this is again sort of more an empirical side, a neurophenomenological line, so empirical in a larger sense. Maybe indeed temporal spatial dynamics is shared by neuronal and mental features. So this is a point we make in this paper there, lower 2020. And here I have this beautiful quote by Nikola Tesla. Look on his website, or look on the website in Google, Wikipedia. It's a very interesting guy, like Elon Musk too. So whatever you think, yeah, but it's very interesting. So meaning here again, you see the empirical move that supports that our mental. So if the word brain is spatial temporal, if I argue that mental features are spatial temporally entailed by the spatial temporal world brain and relation and ontology, then you would argue that brain and mental features must share the spatial temporal features, and that's exactly what we do in this point. And you will see some of the stuff in my empirical talk that we can really show indeed the spatial temporal features of the brain are manifest in corresponding spatial temporal features on the mental level in your inner time and space experience. So in that we speak of concurrency, and that's why we develop spatial temporal neuroscience, all irrelevant in the present context. So basically here, what they share is a topography, dynamic, and of course is space-time, concurrency on the left. And I think with that I come to the last 2-3 slides, and they're very short. So how can this poor guy solve his problem here? So I would argue going beyond the brain over world-brain relation to the world-brain problem, which I consider to be an ontologically plausible problem, presupposing relation-based rather than element-based ontology, and I consider it to be an empirically plausible problem because we can show that, for instance, the spatial temporal world-brain relation is related to consciousness, and so Herr's relation is clear. And can world-brain problem replace mind-body problem? So it's really, as I said, it's a different question. Yeah. So the question of the lower is how are mind and body related to each other. My question is how must the brain be related to the world in order to make possible consciousness? So you see, it's a completely different question. And with my question, all the assumption of panpsychism, monism, dualism are nonsense. Yeah, because they're not conceptually, they're not conceivable within the question of my question. They are conceivable options within, if you ask, how are mind and body related? Then, of course, dualism, panpsychism, blah, 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 blah. But in my context, how must world and brain be related to each other such as that they can make possible mental state? There's no conceptual entailment of all these options. So for me, the question is how mind and body are related. As a wrong question, we need to ask the question, how are world and brain related? And I think an empirical support by our consciousness, and I think you go back, if you want this deeper layer, I would argue with your world-brain relation, spatial temporal ontology, of course, my beloved non-reductive neurophilosophy as a methodological strategy, and by that I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for Professor Northoff for this interesting talk, and especially for your attempts to connect philosophy and neuroscience. It's very important in our time to show the practically utilize for philosophy too, not for practical sciences. And we have a short time for discussion, for question or for replic. And I give the possibility for our online participants, if you have a question, please
raise hand or write finger.
If our now participants please give your question.
Yeah, there is a hand from Alexander.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. My question. Thank you for your lecture, for your speech. My question is that: is it possible that empirically moving from a specific object, the brain, to the world as a whole, or even such features as theoretical physics objects and structures, we lose the touch with the empirical method in general, because the world as a whole, or even some kind of macro-physical structures, are not such, is not an empirically observable object, just like as a brain is, as well as its structures. And empirical scientific knowledge presuppose definition of the object when we make hypotheses and so on and so on. So, is it a problem that we just losing empirical part of our investigation when we make such a theoretical conclusions and theoretical interpretations on empirical based facts about brain? Thank you.
Yeah, very good question. You pointed out you imply the limits of empirical investigation. And I completely agree with that. That's why we need ontology. Yeah, so that goes beyond. However, my methodological strategy, this iterative movement, exactly aimed not to end up in speculation. I'm after all a German and a Kantian. So I want to avoid speculation. But unlike Kant, I don't go to the logical realm, I go to the empirical realm. Yeah. So for me, all is about really say, you pointed out very nicely, empirical observation has its limits, and that's why we need to complement it by an ontological investigation. Yeah. And on the other hand, ontological investigations have also a limit, whether we don't really know whether they're plausible, they're speculative. So that's why I say, in order to sort of close this gap, we will never be able to close this gap. That is a strong argument, but I would say so. We will never be able to do that, but we can try to narrow it. And that's why I have this iterative methodology. Yeah. For instance, remember my example of element versus relation-based ontology, where I would say, yeah, could be pure speculation. We don't know whether relation-based ontology makes sense, yeah, or is plausible. And that I think where you need to go to the empirical realm. But I cannot infer relation-based ontology from the empirical realm. I cannot do that either, because that's my limit. Yeah. So, and I think we need to be very clear. Neurophilosophy always tries to demarcate the limits of both empirical and conceptual approaches, but they also try to look for some overlaps or connections. That's what I'm doing. So in a way, my project is very Kantian. However, it's Kantian only for the natural world. Yeah, because I would say it's basically Kantian. It's a development of the transcendental aesthetics. Yeah, and you see that with the inner and outer time. But unlike Husserl, who also take, as I understand, the transcendental aesthetics as a starting point, I don't limit myself to consciousness. Yeah, I take consciousness, a very important feature, but I go beyond phenomenology. Yeah. And so basically, if you want to say so, rather than going to the logical world and the categories, I go to the natural world and basically put in, if you want to say so, an ecological spin or context on Kant, if you want to say so. I know it's a very liberal view here. Yeah. And then I say, okay, and actually Whitehead has one quote in his Process and Reality. He said, Kant, transcendental aesthetics is great. He should have stopped with the second part. Yeah. Yeah. So I would, yeah, I hope it addresses your question. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay.
So my question is based on the way you try to pose the problem as a relational ontological question about world and the brain connectedness, where the world stays as a first inducing premise and part. So I can first maybe mention that my premises are from phenomenological background. So I'm like following Husserl and Heideggerian line here. But still, I think that there is one thinker in phenomenological tradition who seems to be very relevant here. It's Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Probably you've heard this question many times. Why not posing the question about the relational ontology and the relation between world and body with the brain? Yeah.
Okay. So I smiled because that's where I'm coming from. I did my master's thesis in philosophy about Merleau-Ponty. I was with Weidenfeld, so I know all that stuff. Let me provide a twofold answer because I think it really puts my approach in the context. So first, my first line of answer will be answering, basically commenting on Husserl and Heidegger. Second line will answer to the body, Merleau-Ponty. So first line of answer is, I mean, ultimately, I'm interested in subjectivity. This is clear to everybody who sits around the table here. And so I would not limit myself to consciousness. So you know that Husserl described the concept of pre-reflective self-consciousness, which I think was a very good move against purely cognitive approaches, and that demarcates a phenomenological approach from the cognitive approach. Yeah, and that's what you see. That's resurfaced today in neurophenomenology and so on and so on. And you have also phenomenology of mind, and yeah. However, my criticism towards that is that basically precludes any necessary connection with the empirical world and the brain. Because obviously those 95% of the brain are not conscious. Mm-hmm. So the brain, question for the brain, is a nonsensical question. Yeah, it's a confusion. I know that some phenomenologists would say it's a confusion between the subpersonal and personal level. And it's outside the realm of consciousness as phenomenology is defined. And if you have such a stance, it makes neurophilosophy, in my sense, applied to this problem impossible. Yeah, because you have an intrinsic limit in there. And that's why in my 2014 books, I introduced the concept of pre-phenomena. And the phenomenologists hate me for this because they say this is wrong. Yeah, the border is consciousness. You cannot be free from. But what do I mean by pre-phenomena? I mean those conditions which necessarily predispose consciousness, but consciousness not yet manifest. So that's, I put a Kantian slang here. So now you say, why not going with Heidegger? Yeah, Heidegger is of course perfect case here. Northoff, you do all the world stuff, and of course Northoff, your concept of world is completely underdetermined. I know all that, but time is short in my life. And why not going with fundamental ontology a la Heidegger and things like that? And I'm currently working on that. That I think that what I try to do is an ontology which accounts for the subjectivity, but it's not subject-based, meaning it's not subject-centric, it's not anthropocentric. That's why I included the last 3 chapters of the Copernican revolution in this book. Yeah. So, and now, of course, if you start, let's say with Heidegger, Dasein is thrown in the world, and you know all that, and the temple thing, yeah, Northoff, isn't that your spatial temple ontology? Can't you go with Heidegger and then also with Sartre? And I cannot provide a full-fledged answer to that because this is something I'm really working, but still in Heidegger and also in Sartre, you still have a strong subject-centric approach. The subjectivity is very subjectivity-based. Yeah, Dasein is very existential. Existential is still anthropocentric. So it's a very still even fundamental ontology, and you can trace that in very distinct, specific quotes of Heidegger, and also Sartre too. It's still very anthropocentric because, yeah, it's based on existence, or in the case of Sartre, it's based on consciousness. I mean, Sartre has fantastic descriptions. I mean, I love that. Yeah. But in order to make this necessary a posteriori connection with the brain, I need to go beyond that. So that's what my approach here. Basically, you need to have and develop. You need to have a spatial, a kind of ontology, which sort of entails necessary a posteriori, as I would say, the possibility of mental features. Yeah. So basically, my approach would need to entail the kind of stuff Sartre and Heidegger do. Then I would say we have completed a real world-based and not subject-based ontology, and that is for me necessary for a true Copernican revolution. Yeah. So that's my comment on Slant. So now, within that context, Merleau-Ponty, of course, Northoff. Why don't you do world-body relation? It was so much easier, and the embodied people would be happy, and everything is good, and blah, 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 blah. No, it's not. Maybe I'm wrong here. And as you said, of course, I encountered that many, many times. And so I tell you, as I understand it, the embodied approach is the reaction to the cognitive approach. The cognitive approach associates mental features with the brain. And then the embodied approach says, no, it's embodiment, it's enactment, it's Alvano, it's the 4 E's, embodiment, extendedness, enactment, and what is it? The fourth one, I always forget the fourth one. Yeah, and this is Alvano, is Andy Clark, and all these kind of people nowadays. And I say, so they presuppose the notion, and of course, Merleau-Ponty is lived body. Yeah. So now I'm a phenomenologist and an ontologist together. So now I look, what are the necessary conditions of the possibility of a lived body, as distinguished from the objective body? So that I'm allowed because I do not take a phenomenological stance. If I take a purely Husserlian stance or Merleau-Pontian stance, I will not ask that question. Because for me, I a priori set consciousness as a, McDowell would say, as a given. Yeah, I don't do that. I said, what are the necessary conditions for the kind of consciousness Merleau-Ponty described? So now this allows me to ask the question, what are the necessary conditions for the possibility of the lived body as distinguished from the objective body? And I need to tell you, that distinction is key to the argument, to the word body thing. And that's why I say, no, it is the way how the brain synchronizes with the world, and that makes possible your lived body, because you experience your lived body as part of the wider world. Only because of the relation to the world, your objective body is not identical with the lived body. It's not just, yeah, exactly that. So I would argue when you look into the necessary condition of the constitution of the lived body, then that, at least it's a co-occurring of world-brain and world-body relation. But I know this is, of course, now you could say what you mean, it's a sensory stuff and so. But for the lived body, yeah, that's why I say here's a primacy of the world-brain relation, because you need to be embedded within the world in order for your objective body to become a lived body in the experience. And if you lose that relationship to the world, you lose the lived body, and the lived body is already part of your consciousness. I think it's a fundamental flaw for me of Merleau-Ponty that he basically equates the two. Yeah, he has a double role. The lived body is on the one hand experience, and on the other hand is a necessary condition of experience, and he cannot do that. I think it's a real conceptual flaw. Yeah, I would say that now, without providing details. Yeah.
Thank you. But I don't know if I could continue, or there's someone else maybe to ask.
So now you probably say Northoff is bodiless, but that's not true. Yeah, okay.
Yes, first of all, I thank you for this very important for me words about, first of all, non-reductive philosophy and science, because really we used to hear that in Anglo-American tradition it's mainstream, like a mainstream, yes, but it's corresponds, this words corresponds to our approaches, so it's really very important, and I think it's really important. This approach, I suppose, is really productive for science that deals with brain, and now it's neuroscience and all this science, because the way that analytic philosophy poses this problem, mind-body problem, heart problem, is not productive. It stops development science in the science. My colleague and I are also trying to show it, and trying to prove that this heart problem is like a pseudo problem that is important.
It's nonsense. From my perspective, it's nonsense.
No,
when you read the introduction of my 2008, it was nonsense.
Yes.
Yeah, because it rests on presuppositions which are not plausible. Well,
yes. So if I think really, I do believe that if scientists who work in this tradition take into account your approach, it will be much more fruitful. I would like to pose one topic. I don't know. Is it really so? And I want to hear your opinion about it. Can it be really productive for this approach? Neurophilosophy based on the fact that our brain influence on our consciousness. It's clear. But there is another fact. Is it really so? I would like to hear that our consciousness can influence our brain, our activity, our will, our cognition, social activities forms our brain, influence on our brain. No, first of all, is it really so? Maybe I mistake from point of view of neuroscience. Yes, and if it is so, maybe can it enrich somehow this non-reductive position?
So thanks, of course. First, I completely agree with what you said. For me, the heart problems are probably pseudo problem, and mind, body, and exactly all these impasses which you now see. It's not productive. Yeah. So completely, and that's one of the main motivations of mine. Yeah. Same with the embodied approach. I don't deny that, but I think you need to put it in a larger frame. And here, for the heart problem in mind, it's simply the wrong problem. I'm very clear when I see those discussions. Yeah. First, of course, it looks like, just want to clarify that it looks like, of course, neuroscience, you say that I consider consciousness neuronal. No, I consider consciousness intrinsically neuroecological. Because when you lose this temporal spatial alignment, you lose consciousness. Yeah, we have paper on that, empirical supporting that. Yeah. So I have a whole chapter on this neuroecological. So it's intrinsic, and I do this with a very clever postdoc philosopher and neuroscientist in Italy, Federico Silio. And he's really interested in it. He comes from phenomenology and Sartre, and so one written. So that I think is a key, because if you were saying Northoff, you do consciousness is just neuronal, then you say this is ontologically irrelevant. But as soon as consciousness is considered intrinsically, necessarily so, neuroecological, then you open the door for the ontology. Yeah, at least the way I see it, because you open the door to the world. So that's very key, and we're really trying to support it on empirical grounds. For instance, when your input processing doesn't work, shut down. We had a paper on that last year or this year. You lose consciousness. Whereas if your motor output is deficient in patients with locked-in syndrome, but your sensory input is still processing, then you still have consciousness. Yeah, so that speaks against enactment. Just on a side note, against Albano. Yeah, so it's not empirically supported. Yeah. So that's one thing. That's why we now really investigate a lot this input processing, the kind of coding, how the brain codes the input from the world. It's the empirical side, but has an ontological motivation, this world-brain relationship. Yeah, alignment. Very good question, consciousness and cognition. So I didn't show this here. So we indeed, on the empirical side, we develop what I call spatial temporal neuroscience. So I consider the brain not in terms of single regions, not in terms of single frequency. I consider the whole frequency, but the whole frequency slow and fast, but the relationship between the frequencies. The structure, form, yeah, the form. The same with the different regions. It's not a single regions. It's not just a collection of all regions, but it's the relationship between the regions. It's called topography. Yeah, the form, spatial form. So, and of course, you know where those terms come from. So, and I argue that that impacts your cognition. So your cognition, your affective, and I don't have this picture here, but in my public talk and tonight in the neuroscience talk, you will see I have this picture. Okay, you have the brain, you have spatial temporal dynamic, then you have spatial, then you have mental features, and on top you have cognition. So meaning your cognition has a spatial temporal organization. And I give you an example. When you have your brain activity is too slow, literally, you can measure the speed of brain activity. And that's, for instance, the case in depression. severe depression, you have different kinds of thought contents than when your activity is too fast, like in mania. Why is that so? Because apparently the time scales of your brain are key for integrating different inputs, and that yields particular contents. If you have only short time scales in your brain, you cannot integrate as many inputs, so you have different contents than when you have very longer time scales. You don't have this. When I had all these Zoom talks, my house has different window sizes, and you see different things through it. Same thing here. If you have different window sizes, you can perceive different contents in a more fine-grained way than when you have just one big window size. Yeah. And so, yeah, there's no, yeah, but you know what I mean. Yeah, let's say, so meaning the contents of your cognition are dependent, necessarily, not sufficiently, also upon the time scales and the time windows of your brain. Meaning, and I want to make that as empirical, and we try to do empirical studies for showing that now. Yeah, so spatial temporal neuroscience precedes cognitive neuroscience. Yeah, and why do I do this? Because I clearly see that cognitive affective neuroscience always leaves this gap of contingency to mental features. So you need to go a deeper layer. Yeah, so that's for the question of consciousness cognition. So I would argue yes, then of course, and it also impacts your action. Yeah, so we now do all kinds of empirical stuff where I show that behavioral function, cognitive function have a spatial temporal underpinning. We do this for mind wandering. We look at the dynamics of thought and crazy stuff, but really interesting. Yeah, and that goes what phenomenology described as inner time consciousness, for instance, or inner space consciousness. Yeah. So, and your third question, I can't remember the last
about if it really is, if really our consciousness forms in some aspects our brain, influences on our brain. Is it important for this approach?
What for me really forms the brain, if you use it, and of course for me forming the brain's time and spatial underpinnings of its neuronal activity, it's really the relation to the world. Mm-hmm. Empirically, for instance, early traumatic life events, they really shape the spatial temporal pattern of the brain. Yeah. So, and that in turn, of course, impacts your consciousness. And then, of course, that has a feedback loop, obviously, from the brain world to the world brain. I should have done the feedback loop. I didn't do that. Mm-hmm. Of course, obviously. But that's an iterative. It's not a circular thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Yes, sure. For sure. That's definitely, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a complicated story, as you can see. You all know. Yeah.
Yeah. Nochmals for our question, for our beginning, for our treffen, for our talk, and thank you very much, your Professor Northoff, and our participants for attention, and for last time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.